Sindari and I'm here with Michael Hammer of God, and we are very excited to present a judging arts and science video.
Yes, my name is Michael Hammer of God. I've been playing amp for a long time, and one of my tenets of knighthood is if you've got a belt, you need to prove you still deserve it all the time. So I try and judge arts and sciences at least 2 or 3 times a year, and I've been doing so literally since I got my serpent belt. So I think it's a super important obligation, and I've got some experience. I'd like to help share that with beginning to intermediate judges.
And that's what this class or this video is about, is a beginner and intermediate judge because of the history. You want to tell them about that history?
Yeah, so probably, I don't know, nigh on 17, 18 years ago now, I tackled judging in arts and sciences because it's so subjective, and I wanted to make it a little bit more objective. And so I wrote a bunch of rubrics, talked about exactly how I would make the system where we can define what a 3 is, what a 4 is, what a 5 is, and particularly I looked at it from 3 different features, 3 different parts of how you judge it. And so Di will tell us about those features.
I think the 3 biggest things that any judge is going to look at is aesthetics, which I define as what do you see in terms of its beauty, its technical skill, its how does it look, what is that gut reaction do you have to that item? And then there's complexity, which is how many layers do they put into it? And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go through some examples. But complexity really is how much did you add to that layer? And we'll talk about this in general comments, but that's an element of time that's not expressed as time. And then third is execution. In other words, it doesn't matter at all how complex you make a piece if you didn't execute each of the steps well. And so it's really important to be able to say, I did this very complex piece and I'm looking at it and it's perfect. You executed each one of those steps well. So again, aesthetics, complexity, and an execution are the 3 main things that we'll be using as a framework to go over.
And we'll talk about it a little when we give examples from 2 specific categories of judging. But generally, when you think about something that is very high in aesthetics, but not very good in other things, it's something that's very pretty, it has a lot of a visual appeal, or for a food item, for example, it's very tasty, but not very complex. Box brownies are an example of a food item that does fine on aesthetics, but doesn't get a very good score on either of the other 2. And the same thing applies to anything that's very pretty. If you're talking about something that has high complexity, but not super high in the other areas, it's something where the item's not very functional, it doesn't really do its part well, the execution is sort of not reached its potential, and it's not super pretty, but boy, somebody put a lot of effort into this, and they really just had a great sort of thing they wanted to do, but ended up with sort of a mess that didn't reach its potential. And then finally, if you've got something that's really good at execution, it's the classic of that example of that would be if you've got somebody who's running for champion and there's a sword that is the sword they would like to use every day on the field, and it is a super well balanced sword that they can kill somebody with every day, but there's nothing special about it. It's covered in an opaque cover, but probably just tights. Very, very simple, no complexity, not aesthetically pleasing, but it meets its execution function extremely well.
Agreed.
Okay, so let's cover a few general things, and I will hit one of the first general things that I think is super important to me. That is documentation. If we tell entrants how important it is that they give us documentation, we are obligated to read it, and more than to read it, to compare it to the piece, and make sure we understand what they're saying. Now, because we only have their card or sheet, it is possible that they're going to be giving us information that we cannot sort out, but we certainly have to make an effort to sort it out. So taking the time to study your documentation and compare it to the piece is super important. It does add time to judging, but that's what we're doing here.
Yeah. And documentation, actually, just to follow up on that, can mean a huge difference in what you're scoring that piece as, because you don't know, you have no way of knowing if that brownie was made from scratch necessarily, or if it was homemade, if everything is virtually the same. So that really does influence, I think, in any category, in any
It does.
category
It does.
that you do.
Although the box brownie still should not score that high, even if it's a homemade brownie, not a box brownie, because it still has very high aesthetics and not super high in the other two categories.
Right, absolutely, agreed. Not a trifle souffle.
And not a complex layer of taste,
Right.
just a very simple taste.
Right.
It's a very simple taste I like, and I do like chocolate. So the other thing I want to talk about generally is I want to talk about when you're judging. I think it is extremely disadvantageous to judge in groups. I think that it is entirely permissible for a judge to ask another judge who's expert for more information about a piece. We want to give them the fairest score as possible. But I feel like almost always when judges judge in groups and wander about talking about every piece and then writing down their scores together, the scores cluster very tightly around the judge who has the most charismatic voice. And if it was clustered closely around the judge who had the most expertise around a particular piece, I might be willing to accept it. But that's not who they cluster around. So my advice is if you're a new judge and you're not ready to judge without consulting the other judges right along, you should work and shadow a judge first. Or you should do something to avoid that.
Agreed. Shadow judging is a way to start to test your mettle without feeling like you're giving the bottom line and you're giving the score.
I think you wanted to say something about people who write the hours on their cards.
Oh yeah. So what I've found is that people, especially, will write how much time it took for them to do their piece that they've entered. And I'm saying, as a judge, that should not actually make a difference to you, in as much as it should be reflected in the complexity and in the execution of their piece. You, as a judge, will eventually start to know how much time they spent just by virtue of looking at the complexity and execution and aesthetics of the piece itself.
And I will give you a classic example of this from my amp guard experience. When you're making chainmail, double mail almost literally takes twice as much time as simple 4-in-1 chainmail. But it is not aesthetically 4 times or twice as good. It is not complexity 4 times as good. And it's not execution 4 times as good. It is only slightly better in all those categories. So the fact that the guy tells me, hey, I spent 100 hours on this instead of the other guy who tells me 50 hours, that's nice, and I'm not going to hold it against him, but it hasn't actually improved his piece that much. He'd have been much better off finding things like variations of weaves used in the right places on the garment, color enhancements or other inlays that combined with the weaves to make the thing more complex and more beautiful. Other enhancements that are not chainmail to build a really gorgeous and effective piece of armor than just doubling his work. And then we want to say something about... Oh, yes. Go ahead.
So there's also, judges will be approached with the whole, this is my first piece I made, look at this is amazing, and it shouldn't matter whether that is the person's first piece or the second. That's up to the monarch, and that would be something very important to let the monarch know as they are looking at scoring and possibly awarding that piece. But understand, you're not awarding that piece. You're there as a judge to render an objective opinion on that item. not on that item compared to the skill of the person who made it, not on that item that compares to the other item next to it that's in the same category, on just that item. And that's super important whether they did it one time or 10 times. But I absolutely do think that you should let the monarch know, because that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You want to go into some of the concrete examples now?
Yeah. I think that would be great. Can you stop it for a second?
So the first specific category I want to talk about is weapon construction, because I feel like it's not one that gets covered very often in videos or write-ups, and I'd like to give more education on how we judge that. I already talked a little bit in the intro about a weapon that only has only has execution, which would be a sword that handles great on the field, maybe made by somebody who really cares about amp-guard fighting and wants to fight with it very well, but is undecorated, made with lots of exposed tape, lots of unfinished seams, maybe covered in a pair of tights. That item is going to get a low 3 because all it's got execution. Its aesthetics are poor, its complexity is poor, but even so, that really high score in execution will keep it at a 3, and it should always qualify, but it shouldn't get much higher than that. And there's a converse example of that when you talk about somebody who builds a beautiful, although simple, plastic weapon that handles poorly. Whether it's because it's too heavy or it's unbalanced, just too large, it's a totally unusable weapon, but it's pretty and its complexity isn't high. To me, that is similarly a low 3 item because it's really only doing one thing well. And while it's doing that thing really well, it's not doing the other 2 things well at all. So those are a couple of examples of what I'd look at in the low 3 range. Now I've got a couple examples here that are higher scores, and I want to talk about them too from the same standpoint. And first I'm going to talk about this spear here. This spear here, it's very interesting, but you look at it first, when you first walk up to it, you can tell it's got some wear and tear on the cover. Again, this is an example, not something that's entering competition right now, so hopefully you don't have this kind entering competition, but that's a negative on its aesthetics. All this exposed tape is a negative on its aesthetics. This plain band shop uncovered, and then this pommel is especially on aesthetic. All of this is very plain and not attractive to the eye, not very exciting. The aesthetic score on this thing is just not high at all. Now, when we stop looking at aesthetics and start looking at the other 2 categories, this thing starts really doing much better. Okay, first we want to talk about complexity. First, it comes apart by design to be something that can be stored and traveled with easily, which is a good design for pole arms. And I'm pretty happy with that part of the complexity. All of these elements here are custom laser printed, they're not laser printed, 3D printed to be the required size and shape for this design. That's an interesting, exciting piece of complexity. This piece here is just straight band shop with only a pommel on it, and it allows this same pole to be whatever length you need by cutting your band shop off. This one's cut off almost dead on 5 feet, making a weapon that totals out right at about 8. But if I cut it off at 3 feet, I can get myself a 6-foot pole, or if I take a full band shop core at 7 feet, I can get myself a 12-foot pole, a 10-foot pole out of the same piece of equipment. That is an excellent piece of complexity in engineering. Like, overall, the complexity score on this thing is very high. Then we go to execution, and the first thing I want to do with execution, I want to check its legality, make sure it's nice and safe. This blade is super soft. For a pole arm, it's extremely soft. The stabbing tip is great, very safe. These corners, there are corners. I'm going to take my checker, make sure they're legal. The corners are legal. So from an execution standpoint, this thing's very legal. How does it handle? So I don't like that flex, or that point that looks like a flex point where it's thin in the middle. But when you see it go, it doesn't flex very much. My write-up tells me that this is a solid cord composite, not a hollow composite, which is probably why it handles so well. But I'm already very happy with the execution on this piece too. And an item like this, if I'm scoring it, it gets high on 2 items. And even though it's not very exciting at all on aesthetics, I'm probably giving it a low to mid 4. That's what this item is to me. Now let's go a little farther up the scale and look at something that's pretty interesting in all areas. So this item, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at it from aesthetics, and let's take it for example that this is not the one entered, but instead this was entered 4 years ago when it was brand new. When I'm trying to make this video, I had to look around for examples, and the one I found isn't brand new anymore, but you're never going to have somebody enter one like that. So let's assume this is brand new. Doesn't have any of this wear and tear, none of the nicks and bings, none of the discoloration. So when I first look at it, I'm going to start thinking about aesthetics. And it's got the carved handguard. It's got this beautiful hilts, and that's wood. My write-up tells me that that's inlaid leather in the wood. So this is a lot of work to get a beautiful effect. Then we start looking at all this other plastidip. It's nice. It's beautiful. My write-up tells me that there's a composite in there. When I can do a little twist, I can definitely feel the composite. So it's going to be functional as well as beautiful. The aesthetic score on this thing is going to be very high. Maybe not sky high, because you can add more complexity, do more cool things with your plastidip. But this thing's scoring very high on complexity. And then we're going to start talking about it's going to score very high on its aesthetics. Then we're going to start talking about its complexity. Initially looking at it, it's not a super complex flat blade, but it has a piece of complexity that I read about in my write-up that really turns me on with this. You see that little Allen bolt there. You take that Allen bolt out, and the blade comes on. So you can reblade it. You can rebuild your blade without having to do anything with its gorgeous hilt. This hilt, which will last much longer than any amp guard blade, you can rebuild the blade many times without ever rebuilding the hilt. I did not ask the person who's owned it for the last 4 years if they rebladed it, but it wouldn't surprise me for a second after reading this write-up to find out they had. So complexity is pretty high actually on this thing. I'm happy with it from a complexity standpoint. Then we want to start talking about execution. Execution, the first thing I want to do is I want to check and make sure it's legal. With flat blades, that's super important because you can go wrong on that. First thing I'm going to do is check the tip, no problem. That's perfect. Now I got to check my 2.5 inch striking surface. We're going to see that it goes on and it'll go past barely, but my write-up tells me that his core is extra thin. And again, it says it's a solid composite, which allows him to be thin without sacrificing function. So execution-wise, it's totally legal. That's step one. Second step is, how does it handle? Well, I got an edge on some judges because I've fought a lot for a lot of years. I can pick a sword up right away and decide whether I think it's going to have a high execution value, and this one does. Like my immediate response on picking this up is, oh yeah, I go kill a guy with this right now. This is a good sword. My write-up tells me that part of why is he's put some counterweighting in the handle, and it shows because the balance very good. Like right there. Right there's the balance. It's not perfect balance, but it's an awful good balance, especially for something that's this pretty where you spent this much effort on aesthetics. I think this one has extremely high score in execution, has extremely high score in complexity, and extremely high score in aesthetics. This is the kind of sword I'm going to give a high 4 to, and honestly, a design like this pushes toward a 5. Maybe it needs a little more complexity, a little more something to get a 5, but this is a very nice weapon. I'm very happy to show it off.
Okay. Go.
Okay, I'm going to talk about garb, and we're going to start out with what I consider to be a 3-0 piece. And one thing I want to mention before I start this is that when you're talking about garb category specifically, and this varies by kingdom, some like anonymity, some want you to have the person in it, but in any case, having a dress form or something that will show off your garb to its best advantage is advantageous, and that's for the entrant, but the judges should be aware of that as well. How is this form and fitting? Another point that I want to make is that certain categories are important to make note of, and that is it a fighting garb intended, or was it intended to be a court garb? And those should be scored accordingly, because fighting garb should be probably much sturdier than a court garb piece would be. although as you get higher and higher in complexity and execution, that changes. But here we're going to start with a 3/0 piece. This is what I consider to be a 3/0 piece, and I think it's a great example of a 3/0 piece. What it has is all, you look at the aesthetics of it, it's got a double paneled contrast color, which is very nice. It has, its hem is over and it's serged, and that's super important when you're looking at garb, is how is the finish look. There should be some sort of hem or seam finish to this product, and you can tell on this that it was both serged as well as straight stitched down. So that's nice, and that certainly helps with the complexity of it. So again, going back to aesthetics, this is a two-tone piece, which makes it rather nice. You go into the complexity. Again, because it is two-tone, it does require that you add different elements. It's not just one piece, so that's helpful. But it's not super difficult to do. And then you also have the hem, or the hem finish. So that's aesthetically, it's pretty average. It's pretty good. It's nice. Complexity, again, you're looking at two elements. Looks pretty good. You might even give this like a 3.2, 3.5, around there. And then execution, it was executed very well. There's no loose stitches. There's no fibers that are out of place. And I think that its design is going to last for what it was meant to do. It's a nice linen. It's got very breathable material, and that's helpful. Okay, so let's look at this piece and then compare that if the person, this is a tunic, had added the element of a border or some trim to that, to this 3/0 piece. That would increase the complexity. So when I look at aesthetics of this piece, I think I love the green. I love the contrast of the trim to the black sleeve addition. But it is a fairly simple tunic, classically done. It has, we look at aesthetically, it's about middle of the road. Complexity, though, increases because of the trim added, the end pieces added. You've got some different facing, which increases the element, and then you also got your serge seam, which the other one had. But because this does have trim, that increases the complexity, and because the trim is sewn down well, it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. That means that it was executed well, and that's what we're looking at. So this would be probably around a 3.5, 3.7 piece. Okay. And then we have a piece. Let's take this first from an aesthetic point of view. It's aesthetically gorgeous. It has a lot of contrast to it that make it very nice. I don't know if you can see that, but this has a ton of aesthetic elements to it. Yellow matching this yellow, trim matching trim. It's nice and even on both sides. If you quarter panel this, it would be even. Those are all part of the aesthetics to me. Then we get into complexity. Complexity of this piece. Not only do we have nice seams, but we also have trim. And then we have several elements that increase that. We've got some satin stitching here that is absent on the other piece. And we have some applique pieces. And that certainly increases the complexity of this piece by quite a bit. If we looked at it under this way, please understand that this is an example only. This has been in use for several years, so it's not right fresh out of the box, which is what you will be judging when you're judging something. Is something right out of the box, right as you did it. These are sewn well, and you know, there's a testament to the skill of the maker is how this thing has lasted for quite a while under heavy use. That's what a fighting tunic ought to be able to do. So that actually is part of the execution of the item, is how well is it holding up to the use. So if I look at this again, pulling this all in together, the aesthetics are gorgeous to me. I love the colors. I love the symmetry of the design. I think it's really nice. And then I look at the complexity of the piece. We've got satin stitching here. We've got overlay. We've got trim pieces. Then we come down to the bottom and again have a lot of applique. The applique is not overly much so that the fighter part of it, the tunic part, is still breathable without being too oppressive. And when you switch it and you look at it, it actually, the seams and whatnot look they're very good. So this is a great piece. I think aesthetically it gets good grades. Complexity, it gets good grades. At execution, when it was first made, I'm pretty sure that I judged this piece, so it got good scores on execution as well.